Good day, and welcome to this fifth and penultimate plenary of the conference, titled Women's Leadership and the Call to Justice in Jesuit Higher Education. I'm Patricia Grant, and I'm joining you from the virtual home of the McDonough School of Business at Georgetown University, here in the atrium of the Rafiq B. Hariri building. For the last decade, I've had the pleasure of working with our 1,300 undergraduate business students, and today I manage their day-to-day academic and student experience as the Dean of the undergraduate program in business. Faith that does justice is key to our work. Today, our focus is on women's leadership and the call to justice in Jesuit higher education. This is no small topic, and there are no easy strategies or solutions to manifesting justice in Jesuit higher education. The good news is that women have answered the call to serve and sound off about how to advance and advocate for justice in the Jesuit quarters of the field. We not only have heeded the call, but embraced the charge to open our eyes to injustice and do something about it. Working and serving in Jesuit higher education is not simply about empty actions, but about reflective practice that collectivizes our conscience for critical transformational action. This is deeply rooted in our personal commitment to give, serve, and engage toward the goal of change for those people and communities that need our intervention and engaged allied support. It's serious, and it's about faith that does justice. Now, I'd like to turn the panel over to Erica Kirby, Professor of Communication Studies and AF Chair in Community at Creighton University. She will moderate our exciting panel with four amazing women in Jesuit leadership on this subject and so many others that are related. Today, we're joined by Margo Heydt, Associate Professor of Social Work at Xavier University, Michele Murray, Vice President for Student Affairs and Dean of Students at College of the Holy Cross, Stephanie Russell, Vice President for Mission Integration at the Association of Jesuit Colleges and Universities, and Tania Tetlow, President of Loyola University, New Orleans. After the plenary, we invite all participants to log on to Zoom for a live Q&A with the panelists, and then an examine with Juniper Ellis. You don't want to miss it. Professor Kirby, over to you.
Thank you, Dean Grant. For today's plenary, we will start with an individual video followed by a panel discussion. As some of you may know, in 1995 at General Congregation 34, the 14th decree that was written was entitled Jesuits and the Situation of Women in the Church and Civil Society. We were going to commemorate the 25-year anniversary of that decree at last year's conference, which of course was postponed. And so we are doing it this year instead as part of how we designed this plenary. So to begin, Dr. Margo Heydt will provide context for the decree based on her fellowship work. We will then proceed with the panel.
Greetings. As a Protestant feminist social work professor at a Jesuit university in the Heartland for over 20 years, Decree 14 has presented a mystery to me from my first encounter with it in 2003. Decree 14 is a solidly feminist document apologizing in writing to women for Jesuit oppression of women and calling for Jesuits to listen to women's experiences in order to act in solidarity with women. It did not seem that the decree, which was almost 10 years old at the time, was very well known. In fact, it felt almost like a secret document. And from my first reading of it, I also felt it was not entirely written by men. In 2014, I was awarded a Jesuit faculty fellowship research sabbatical called A Jesuit Whodunit, Decree 14. This research unearthed the history of how a large international group of celibate religious men drafted and approved such a strongly worded document. Oral histories were conducted in Seattle, Ireland, and Australia. One of my conclusions was that Decree 14 is a powerful story of faith and hope and justice seeking that needs to be told and retold to Catholics and non-Catholics to reinvigorate its use and avoid reinventing the wheel. This presentation is a brief introduction to the story of Decree 14. And yes, I was right. Women's voices were part of the story. Women, Jesuits, and social justice. The whodunit of Jesuit Decree 14. This is a timeline of Jesuits and women. The Society of Jesus, of course, founded in 1540. There was a very small, brief women's branch of Jesuits. Women were very attracted to the Jesuit way of thinking. But Ignatius himself approached the Pope to free the Jesuits from spiritual direction of any women, which he did in 1547. In 1554, Princess Juana of Spain secretly entered the Society of Jesus as a permanent scholastic, and she died with her secret in 1573. Fast forward a little over 400 years, and you have the General Congregation 34 issuing Decree 14 in 1995. Then, just now in March, the Commission on Role and Responsibilities of Women in the Society of Jesus was established. The mystery of Decree 14 to me was to find out the answers to the W questions: who, what, when, where, and why. You can find the document on the Jesuit website. It is a short document and it's very readable, and I hope you will look for it. Everyone I interviewed pointed towards Jerry O'Hanlon as the primary initiator and author of the decree. When I interviewed him in 1995, he was a staff member at the Jesuit Center for Faith and Justice and associate professor of systematic theology at Milltown Institute in Dublin. While I was in Dublin, I also interviewed 5 other people involved, including 3 of the women. And Lawrence Murphy, who was also the provincial in 1995, Jerry was a delegate. Author number 2, Patrick Howell, was a professor at Seattle University, and he was a longtime editor of Conversations on Jesuit Higher Education magazine. While I was in Seattle, I also interviewed his president of Seattle University, Stephen Sundberg, who was also a member of the General Congregation 34. Author number 3, Bill Uren, who was known for his red editing pen, was the rector of Newman College at the University of Melbourne in Australia when I interviewed him. I also had the opportunity to interview 3 others while I was in Australia, including another one of the women. Some general facts about GC 34. General Congregation is what the Jesuits call their highest decision-making body. In 1995, that was only the 8th GC to be called for circumstances other than the election of a Father General. The congregation lasted from January 5th to March 22nd, was one of the longest running GCs, and included 223 Jesuit delegates from more than 80 countries, representing 23,000 plus Jesuits internationally at that time. The Assembly of Jesuits is called the Aula while they are meeting as one body in the designated meeting hall. This is a map, a reminder of the Jesuits being a global and international order. These colors represent the provinces around the world in 1995. This is not accurate today. two separate international processes intersected with Jerry O'Hanlon at GC 34. At the larger level was the usual global preparation for a GC, a two-year process. All provincials attend. The Jesuit in charge, the Jesuit leader in charge of the province is called a provincial. Each province also elects a delegate. So there are two representatives from each province. The Ireland province elected Jerry O'Hanlon as their delegate. There is a very long democratic process about what issues should be on the official GC agenda, especially when it's not about selecting a new Father General. The Jesuit communities contribute their thoughts to the provincials who forward the information up the chain, and it comes from a very grassroots Jesuit level. Through this process of choosing topics for the agenda, 15 commissions were established and each assigned its topic. Women's issues were coming up here and there through this two-year process as a possible topic. It did not make the final cut and was not on the final official list of topics for the assembly. A very important change was made, however, for this general congregation. The rules for proceeding included a new, unique opportunity for individuals to put forward a topic from the floor that was not included in the official list for the commissions. This plays an important role in what happens for Decree 14. There were the second of the two intersecting international processes primarily occurred in Ireland. In the 1980s, the Catholic Church had increased emphasis on the role of lay persons in the church, and many ministries were including discussions of both lay people and Jesuits of current social issues. Phil Harnett, a Jesuit from Ireland, observed such groups occurring in several countries when he was visiting in South America, and they were called Signs of the Times groups. He brought back that idea to Ireland, and Signs of the Times groups, seminars, retreats were established in Ireland. Many included women, and of course, women were bringing up women's issues in those meetings. In 1991, Jerry and 3 other Irish Jesuits who were involved in the Signs of the Times meetings in Ireland decided to co-author a booklet called Solidarity, the Missing Link in Irish Society. And its purpose was to describe how Jesuits and lay colleagues could come together to read the Signs of the Times and talk about current social issues. For a few years after that, the women who had been involved in these meetings challenged the book and the authors, primarily led by Kathy Malloy and Edel Kennedy, and they challenged for an explanation about why there was no discussion in the book of solidarity with women or women's issues. So the assembly began on January 5th. On January 12th, several people I interviewed described Jerry as literally standing in the aula. He's now determined to show solidarity with women and takes advantage of the new rule. So he stands and proposes treating women as a separate topic, even though it did not come up through the provinces as an agenda item. And this is a picture of Jerry on the right in the aula in the assembly meeting. The next day, January 13th, the assembly votes to accept the proposal. And instead, there was quite a bit of discussion about whether it should be its own commission or not. Ultimately, it was assigned as a subcommission to the Commission on Justice rather than a separate commission. And Jerry was asked to chair that. Bill Uren and Pat Howell approached Jerry right away to join his effort. Others also joined, and there is general agreement that men cannot write a document about women without consulting women. So how to do this? The subcommission on women forms, and the group agrees on a radical way of proceeding. As far as anyone knows, I have multiple sources of input on this. This was the first time a group decided that consults with persons outside of the general congregation membership would be allowed, and the first time that those consults could include non-Jesuits. So this is the way, the mechanism they came up with to include women's voices. Much discussion individually and in small groups occurred over the weeks. Jerry offered 10 different official drafts, the shortest one being little more than 2 pages. The groups went back and forth. Each draft was based on both written and verbal comments from assembly members. Both lay and religious women continued to be consulted throughout the process. At the time, keep in mind, it's 1995, social media was not what it is today, and that consultation was occurring mostly through faxing things back and forth. This is a map indicating that this activity occurred in Rome. Of the 6 Jesuits and 7 women who were primary. And you can see it was an international effort. Of the women, the woman from Australia, the sister from Australia, who was given credit for the strongest input, had passed away, and I was not able to interview her. A couple of other women and men did not respond to my outreach, but I was able to interview a majority. The final vote occurred on March 15th. The final draft was one of the longer versions and stood as a separate document. There was discussion about whether it should be tacked on to the report from the Commission on Justice, since it was a subcommission of that group, but the decision was that it should stand on its own as its own separate document. Decree 14 passed in Loyola by a wide margin, and on March 16th, Jerry, Bill, and Pat celebrated over dinner. March 20th, press briefings began. The National Catholic Reporter in the United States, March 31st, does an article quoting with commentary from Jerry about the Jesuits pledging solidarity with women. On April 7th, the National Catholic Reporter published the entire decree. Then what? Many men and several women from around the world participated in the production of this document. Was there an implementation plan? Was a big question for me. But I was informed that none of the decrees have an implementation plan. This is part of the Jesuit way of proceeding. This is a decree is what they all agree on at the assembly, but every delegate, all the delegates take the decrees home with them and use them in the best ways, most effective ways for them in their home communities. So there's no official implementation plan for any decree. My research showed that in the United States, the 10th anniversary of Decree 14 was recognized at the Jesuits and Feminists Conference at Fairfield University in 2006. I was unable to identify other events marking the 20th or the 25th anniversaries. But now there's a new agenda. March 8th, 2021, International Women's Day. Father General Arturo Sousa announces the creation of the Commission on the Role and Responsibilities of Women in the Society of Jesus. It includes 6 women, 3 Jesuits, and 1 lay man from 8 countries. The final report is to be submitted to him in 3 years. The first objective of this commission is to return to Decree 14 and evaluate its relevance in the contemporary world. Other objectives include reviewing the society's structures of collaboration with women. Dr. Donna Andrade from Fairfield College Preparatory School in Connecticut is the chair. So that is the Decree 14 whodunit in a nutshell. Usually I provide a hard copy handout of the decree when I present about it. For this presentation, here are 3 slides quoting the document that stand out as statements of justice seeking and that specifically made me wonder about the inclusion of women's voices. In the opening about the role and responsibility of Jesuits, the decree states, the Society of Jesus accepts this challenge and our responsibility for doing what we can as men and as a male religious order. We do not pretend or claim to speak for women. However, we do speak out of what we have learned from women. The yellow emphasis is mine. In the section on ways forward, the document states, we invite all Jesuits to listen carefully and courageously to the experience of women. Many women feel that men simply do not listen to them. There is no substitute for such listening. Listening in a spirit of partnership and equality is the most practical response we can make and is the foundation for our mutual partnership to reform unjust structures. The document then goes forward to list 8 practical ways to contribute. And finally, in the conclusion, we Jesuits first ask God for the grace of conversion. We have been part of a civil and ecclesial tradition that has offended against women. And like many men, we have a tendency to convince ourselves that there is no problem. By making this declaration, we wish to react personally and collectively and do what we can to change this regrettable situation. Above all, we want to commit the society in a more formal and explicit way to regard this solidarity with women as integral to our mission. As you can see, Jerry moved from leaving women out of his own book about solidarity in Ireland to ending this amazing document, committing the entire Jesuit order to solidarity with women as integral to the Jesuit mission. Thank you for listening, and thank you to the women and many Jesuits who responded to my research.
Well, thank you, Dr. Heydt, for giving us that great context on your project for us to build from, including the information on the Commission on the Role and Responsibilities of Women in the Society of Jesus. Just in case people were unaware, I would like to note that one of our own is on that commission. The co-chair of our conference, Dr. Mike Duffy from the University of San Francisco. Now we will move into the panel discussion portion of our plenary. We build on the decree to involve women in the work of the Jesuits in church and civil society to more specifically discuss women's leadership in Jesuit higher education. Our panelists, President Tania Tetlow, Dr. Stephanie Russell, and Dr. Michele Murray, were asked to consider the decree alongside their experiences in Jesuit higher education, and Dr. Heydt is back with us as a guest. We are organizing the panel around 3 central questions. For each question, panelists will give us their thoughts for 3 to 4 minutes. So we will have 10 segments or 10 to 12 segments of dialogue. So for the first question, I'm going to ask Dr. Stephanie Russell of the AJCU to respond first. And here is the question. How would you characterize the current state of women's leadership in higher education?
Well, thank you for that very large and elastic question. And I want to say before beginning how honored and delighted I am to be with this particular group. This is just a joy. So thank you for the invitation. In response, I guess I would say, as Dr. Heydt points out in her talk, there was significant activity around the revisit to Decree 14 around the 10th anniversary, and sort of every sort of marker, every 5-10 year marker around the pot kind of gets stirred to some extent for those anniversaries. And in the intervening years, Jesuit Higher Ed, both the number and the influence of women in the colleges and universities has moved steadily forward, sometimes in visible ways, sometimes in really sadly unheralded ways. The presence of women in senior leadership, of course, is just one indicator among many. Most of us are not, who are women in our schools, are not necessarily in senior leadership positions. But since 2014, for example, we've added 3 and soon to be 4 women to the presidential ranks. Our own President Tetlow, who's with us today, President Linda Lemura at Lemoyne College, President Joanne Rooney at Loyola University, Chicago, and as of July 31st, Dr. Colleen Hanich will become president at Xavier University. So this is all really good news. 13 of the chief academic officers are women today. That's a changing demographic sometimes, but almost half, as are 8 of the chief mission officers. I don't currently have firm numbers on deans and vice presidents and junior and senior faculty, along with staff. And of course, numbers don't tell the whole story. You know, it's one thing to fill the organizational chart with women. It's another to ask the question of how they're able to exert influence and engage in leadership and decision-making in the institution. So in the last 10 years in particular, we're seeing a growing wave of women leaders, both veteran and new, who are theologically conversant, deeply committed to the mission, and really capable of shaping their own Ignatian identities. Some of them, you may have noticed, were tapped during the mission priority examen process to lead or participate in visiting teams. And some are leading major academic initiatives. I think of people like Dr. Nancy Tuckman at Loyola Chicago, Dr. Jody O'Brien at Seattle U, or Dr. Christine Fear-Hinsey at Georgetown, all of whom are on our national resources on really key academic issues. But there's not, to my knowledge, much phenomenological recording of the advances of women in Jesuit higher ed as a whole. And I just think that's unfortunate, because I do think we're in the midst of a significant change, not only with respect to who contributes to and leads the school, but how that leadership is exercised. Not every woman leads in the same way, but my own anecdotal experience tells me that embedding women leaders in positions of service and influence in the schools changes not only how the leadership is exercised internally, but also how the institutional relationships are built across schools. And of course, we're at this point of really trying to forge a network among these North American schools. So concerns about the value that we place on women remain. We all know that. The advances made by women are disproportionately, although not solely, those of white women instead of BIPOC women. The emergence of women in leadership varies by field. Women CFOs are in shorter supply in Jesuit higher ed than women deans of education. And we've all seen the national data on women junior faculty who tend to shoulder bigger workloads, and for some of them, bigger home responsibilities if they have children. So when I talk about fits and starts, it's not as if progress isn't being made, because it really is. I just think we have a way to go in making it intentional and steady and measured.
Thank you so much. President Tetlow, would you mind answering the same question of how you would characterize the current state?
Well, I don't have the broad overview that Stephanie gave, but I can just talk about here at Loyola in my own little bubble. It has been a real joy and sometimes a challenge to be the first woman president. I can never quite tell the reaction I'm getting, how much of it is about being female versus being the first lay president, because both of them are jarring adjustments for the institution. I will tell you that I sat and met early on with a an alum, big donor. And I said, I take very seriously the responsibility of being the first lay president. And he said, well, it's not just that, it's that you're a woman that I think bothers people. And in his out loud voice. And for once in my life, I thought of the response, not a month later, but in the room. And I said, well, I guess there's nothing I can do about that you would approve of, which was great because it went right over his head. Anyway, I have a cabinet now here that is majority female. I have a female CFO. I have a woman provost, both of them women of color. That just happened, I think, a combination of hiring the most qualified people and also women who were eager to work on a team as diverse as this is and to work with me. We also have to remember that our institutions serve a student body that is majority female, and in a place like Loyola, almost 2/3 female. And I wonder how much that will start to be a pressure that builds up that people acknowledge. I think there's a model of university presidencies, particularly at secular institutions, that treats them as CEOs and really looks for the kind of swagger that a corporate CEO would have. I do think there is a difference in the Jesuit model of leadership that in some ways I think makes it easier for women. It is a servant model of leadership. So I'm replacing a president who didn't live in a great big grand university house. He lived in the freshman residence halls for 14 years, right? So there's a different model of how much you're supposed to suck the air out of the room. And I think that way that women are trained, it's not biological or innate or in any sense, but that fraught relationship that we're trained to have with our own ambition makes us tend to be humble, at risk of being self-deprecating in ways that get in our way. But I really have loved reading leadership literature and Harvard Business Review articles and see them come around to the idea of humility as a major leadership skill in the most self-interested and masculine of terms. So I do think we have real advantages there. And I will say that to be at Loyola, when I want to talk about compassion for families in our HR policy or how we will be kind to each other, I don't have to translate myself into the language of self-interest. I can just talk about mission and who we are and what our values are. And that feels to me much more welcoming of the kind of leader that I want to be. So I think that there are a lot of obstacles still to remain and our numbers are still few. The other women presidents and I really glory in our relationship and in supporting each other. But we are 3, now about to be 4 of 27. So it is a far cry from really feeling like all of our talents are being used, but we're getting there.
Thank you so much. And Dr. Murray, same question, characterizing the current state.
Sure, I'm happy to respond. And also thank you very much for including me on this panel. I have been listening to President Tetlow and Dr. Russell, and I am humbled by the words that they have. I think, when I thought about this question and the current state of women's leadership in Jesuit higher education, I've been thinking over the course of my career, in these 25 or whatever it's been years. And initially, I would say things are vastly improved than when I first started out in Jesuit higher education, a quarter of a century ago, in that women are in very visible leadership positions. I think the women's voices, I hear, that our voices are taken seriously, more seriously perhaps than I thought they were taken, back when. And so I find that to be really very hopeful. I find it hopeful that, at the 10-year mark of a GC 34, that a group gathered at the institution where I was at that time, and I'm now on my 3rd Jesuit institution. And we talked, men, women, Jesuit, and lay, talked about what that decree meant and where we were as an institution. And the fact that we could have that conversation, I thought was really, that was a really important step that signaled something to me. Now, I also hear what my colleagues are saying, right? And the state, although improved, is not perfect, and there is a lot that we can and need to do. I have been really fortunate that in my current role, my current institution, our executive cabinet is 75% women, and I believe the decisions we make, how we get to those decisions, is very much influenced by who we are and the experiences that we bring. And I think we are better for it. I also, at my previous institution, had the phenomenal experience of joining with other women lay collaborators as we wanted to pursue our own deepening of our understanding and lived reality of Jesuit and Ignatian spirituality. And we were helped along by our Jesuit colleagues, right, who were very invested in a group of women doing that for ourselves. And that to me also was very hopeful. I don't know how we can be taken seriously as contributors if we are not also allowed into that circle around the spirituality and what that means. And so that we were helped by our Jesuit colleagues was and encouraged, was a hopeful sign to me. So again, while I look over the course of my career, I think we are in a much better place than we were when I first started as a young pup, I guess. And I'm looking forward to the mileage that we still have in front of us, because I think there are a lot of women who are right here ready to go. And I will also say there are a lot of men who are interested in partnering. And are demonstrating their interest in partnering. So.
Thank you so much, all three of you. The second question that I was hoping to get your perspective on takes us down the road you all started to dabble on a little bit, which is, what are the biggest challenges to advancing women's leadership in Jesuit higher education? And President Tetlow, we're going to start with you on this one.
And you get to see my daughter in the background, work family juggling in progress. I mean, there are so many things. In some ways, taking your place in leadership among Jesuits themselves, you sort of feel like you're 10 years behind in the training that they get to be steeped in the spirituality and theology and the understanding and the culture of it all. And that can be really daunting. And so that work of formation, how we catch up, which has become even more pressing because as we have fewer priests, we need that entirely, right? If we're going to keep the charism. For me, I really worried about that when I started this job. You know, my one form of rebellion in my family was to not go to a Jesuit institution, as my parents have both done for many, many degrees, and to not want to be a theologian when I grew up. And so when I started this job, I was pretty worried about how, was I prepared enough for that role? And I talked to my uncle Joe, Father Tetlow, who's he's a Jesuit who's 90 years old now. And some of you have read his writing. And he just laughed and he said, you had no choice about the training. Between him and the fact that my father was a Jesuit for 17 years before he left to have a family. And this is a new form of formation, but the president of St. Joe's is also the child of a former Jesuit. So I was sung to sleep as a baby with Gregorian chant. He tried to teach me algebra at way too young an age with flashcards and talk about the God's delight in math. My mom is a feminist theologian, so I would go to middle school religion and try to explain that in Aramaic, the Holy Spirit is in female pronouns, and then I get in trouble for that. So there was an awful lot that I was just sort of raised in. And I remember speaking on my first Province Day before ordination here a couple of years ago. And the first question I asked all the assembled Jesuits, about 100 of them, how many of you have known me since the day I was born? And a bunch of hands went up. So I feel really comfortable in this world. And I feel like the Jesuits are so supportive and they just have my back and they believe in me. And that's really helped me not worry so much about the formal training and just realize that I get it at a fundamental level. And in some ways, not saying that in exactly the same trite mantras makes people believe it, that I can sometimes, they laugh because they say, you tell the community what we've always been saying, but they hear you in a different way. They listen to you in a different way. And I do think that's an advantage. I do a lot of thinking about how to translate to people who understand or are schooled, who are Catholic or religious and not Catholic, or who are secular and philosophically motivated, and sort of put it in every term such that it will be more persuasive and kind of be formation unto itself. So I do think also that I've tried to explain to the Jesuits themselves that for our community, we don't feel like we're just doing mission when we start a meeting with a prayer, that the ways that we kill ourselves to make a university like Loyola sustainable, the ways that we bend over backwards for our students, that is mission, and that we are all really carrying that forward. So those are some of the challenges. And I also think that until the Jesuits really acknowledge gender as a fundamental and primary issue, that there will only be so far we get. So I feel this tolerance and this acceptance, but it really strikes me that gender is not one of the apostolic preferences, right? If you think about deep-rooted societal problems that wreak havoc with the world, one economist estimated that there are 100 million missing women in the world who have been killed as babies or as adults, right? That there's just so much violence, there's so much deprivation and poverty, there's so much grueling oppression in that regard that it feels like it should have made that list. And I think when we really start to grapple with it overtly, then we'll make better progress.
Thank you so much. I feel like on the committee, we sort of fudged and like, we feel like gender's an apostolic preference, but agree with you, it's not called out as such, right? Dr. Murray, what are your thoughts on the idea of challenges?
Yeah, well, I'm going to sort of pick up where President Tetlow left off. You know, I think it's really fitting that both the GC 34 and the new commission, right, are grounded in culture and understanding that we're speaking to a global church and our cultures vary from place to place. Because, you know, when I thought about this question, the first part of my response was, well, our challenges at Jesuit higher education institutions are the same ones that are out there in our culture. And they are things like pay equity. They are things like, you know, when President Tetlow, I think, was talking about that leadership swagger, there's a gendered sort of preconception of what leadership is. And that affects all of us, right? We still are living in a society where domestic responsibilities are, they're not equally divided. If you have a two-person household that's heterosexual, right? You know, they're not equally divided. And so all of those things that are out there in society hit home at the institution as well. And so I think, you know, as we get real with the challenges and as we try to understand who we are as brothers and sisters in Christ, as brothers and sisters in a mission, in a common mission, we have to come face to face with the ways in which we have been, I'll say, programmed by society to understand gender differences in a particular way. So, you know, that hits our institutions in terms of, you know, when we think about leadership or who we might go first to hire, or who we might be thinking about in terms of departmental leadership or deanship, any kind of leadership position, and what we are expecting out of that leader. We will have this nut to crack for as long as society has this nut to crack. And I a little bit feel like Debbie Downer saying that. I just think it's important to be realistic about where we are as a society. And I am just championing and jumping up and down for the women who who are presidents of our institutions, for the women who are mission officers in our institutions, for the women who are providing leadership at the national level at our AJCU office. I'm so excited for the path that all of us are laying out for the women who are coming behind us, but not just the women, but also the men, right? That we are demonstrating in very real ways what leadership looks like, and how we might think about it differently and break some of the molds that we have inherited. And that's the work that we're doing right now, I think, is breaking some of those molds. And there are women who paved the path for me, and I'm grateful to them as well. So, you know, it is a bit of a pay it forward situation until we crack this nut, as I said.
Thank you. And realism is always welcomed. Do not worry about that. Dr. Russell, your thoughts?
Well, those were just really incisive comments from both of you, and I want to build on a couple of those. But before I do, I want to correct myself from earlier and to say that I've actually forgot a woman president in our list earlier, who is President Alice Peralta at St. John's College in Belize. And St. John's, you may know, is quite recently a full member, no longer an associate member of the AJCU. And so I want to be sure and lift her up as one of the 5 rather than the 4 as we continue the conversation. So that's on me, but just wanted to share her wonderful leadership with the group as a whole. So, so in terms of the question, you're right, we did sort of start to move into challenges a little bit at the beginning, because that's just part of the state of things, right? But I couldn't agree more with what was said. Just to add a few things, I think one of our challenges is that being a liberating force for and with women isn't really central to the way we talk about the mission of Jesuit higher education. So when we talk about being persons for and with others, or a faith that does justice, and marginalized communities, I think we are easily sort of rocked into sleep by these amazing women around us on our own campuses who are, thank you very much, exercising terrific leadership, and who are showing themselves to be quite amazing servant leaders in our context. But we don't necessarily link both the remaining issues to be dealt with, some of which we've talked about in our schools, with also the circumstances of women domestically and internationally in our wider communities, in the community of God. And so we sort of float along on a cloud of illusion sometimes, I think. And that's in some ways lovely, because it means this real progress is being made in our schools, but it's also very counter to what our mission is about. So we lack specificity around women when we talk about the mission. That would be one thing. A couple other things that are just kind of add-ons to things that were mentioned is that we haven't really established networks for mentoring and support and growth for women leaders. There are a lot of women and men. Jesuits were mentioned earlier as quite a support to many women leaders, and that's certainly been my experience too. There's a lot of sort of happenstance networking and mentoring that goes around, but I don't know that we've been particularly organized about that. And we have a cadre of younger women in our institutions who are tremendous gifts to the apostles of Jesuit higher education that are asking for that. And so I think just kind of an attentiveness to that. They don't need to be told what to do. They need support, and they need context, and they need affirmation, like we all need or have needed at various points in our lives, that yes, it really is okay to speak up, and yes, what you have to contribute is really of value, etc. So that's the second thing. And then finally, Father Sosa has taken this step toward clarifying what the Society of Jesus relationship is going to be with women, and what women's, to try to lift up from women what we wish, which is not going to be all the same thing, our relationship with Jesuits and Jesuit ministries, and especially higher ed, is going to be. Decree 14 sort of sat on the shelf as a beautiful poem to be brought down once in a while and recited at will, and then placed back for the next special occasion. And I think at least what I'm getting so far from the establishment of this commission is that there's a desire to really break that open. But that's going to take relationship. And it's going to take relationship, certainly by the members of the commission, but by all of us in our own institutions, women and men, around this topic. This question of what does it mean to listen to women? What does it mean, even frankly, for women to listen to women about their reality, and what context we can create for that is really interesting to me. And so I have some, even though that's a challenge, I have some energy around that.
Thank you all so much. And we get to end then with what are our dreams for women's leadership in Jesuit higher education? And Dr. Murray, I'm going to start with you on this one.
Yeah, thank you. Not to sound trite in any sort of way, but my first reaction to that question is, I hope 25 years from now, we don't have to have this conversation. That is my biggest dream. You know, with the previous question, I was thinking about, but failed to mention, so I will say now, right, in the spirit of being real, that where we are in Jesuit higher education, even in this country, right, is also firmly situated in the church's relationship with women. And so, you know, I'm always hopeful that good progress is afoot and will be on its way. So I hope that we continue in that. But for us to not have to have this conversation 25 years from now, I think there are some larger issues in the global church that may need some addressing. Having said that, you know, my other hopes for the future really are tied to our commitment as Jesuit institutions that we are people who are of faith and do justice out of that faith, right? And I'll borrow from one of my Jesuit friends who reminds us that, you know, faith without justice is empty, right? And justice without faith is unmoored. So there is a way that as we call for justice, particularly, well, not particularly, but around gender issues, that we dig deep into who we are as people of God and what the larger mission is, and what our spiritual tradition tells us about the preciousness and dignity of each and every one of us. Right? That feels like the right and most important starting point, and everything else grows from there. And of course, the issues that we contend with at our institutions, culturally, societally, they're really signals that we are so far away from what our faith demands of us. So, you know, maybe my hope for the future is utopian. I think perhaps it might be, but I also hope that it's realistic, right? I want my 9-year-old daughter to inherit a world different than the one that I inherited, and I think we're working steadily towards that. I do think the more we have all of our people, men and women, people of all genders, understanding the role and contribution that women play. And you know, Dr. Russell mentioned that there's a lot that's going on that's not being recognized. And so that all of that needs to be brought to the fore too. But as we are recognizing the role that women are playing, have played, and will continue to play, right? I think that the easier, I hope, the easier it will get.
Thank you so much. Dr. Russell, what are your dreams?
Well, that was incredibly beautiful. Thank you for that. I guess my dreams are not programmatic, and that's not what Dr. Murray was saying either. My dreams are bigger than that, and I guess I would frame it by saying I hope the gospel lays a bigger claim to us. and that the relationship of Jesus with women lays a bigger claim to us institutionally. Even in our pluralistic, multi-faith institutions, that we open our arms to embrace a way of being with each other that is unapologetic about connection and compassion with each other, and that includes the women among us. And so the other thing I think would be, we sometimes treat the Ignatian tradition as a precious family jewel that is handed to us that we ought not damage. Just don't trip while you're holding it, because it's all going to go south after that, And so what I would hope is that, and this is not just a women's maybe consideration, but it certainly is that too, that we each see the reception of that gift as something living that we are responsible for tending to and growing, which means that the lives tending to it are going to have an organic influence on it, including the lives and experience of women. And so when we hear in our mind's eye, when we enter into, for example, an Ignatian contemplation, or when we hear somebody talk about the examen, that those voices internally that come to us are as easily the voices of women as men, that they are shared communion. And that's, and maybe that goes back to Michele's comment about just, oh, we don't have to have this conversation in 25 years. I couldn't agree more.
Thank you so much. And President Tetlow, your thoughts?
Thing that gave me hope this year was that our Jesuit provincial, Father Tom Green, for the Central and Southern Province, had the idea of a commission on women, and actually reported that to Father General, and that may have been some of the germ of the idea of the global one. But he gathered a few of us together by Zoom, along with some other Jesuits, and they listened to us, and we sort of poured our hearts out of how painful it is to be so devoted to and passionate about and supportive of an institution that doesn't let us in. And the just sort of sorrow we carry with that, of how much when we go to an ordination, it is such a joyful and also painful moment to watch. And that fundamentally, my dream is that we get to the place where the church itself doesn't squander half of humanity's talent. And as Stephanie said so well, there are so many clues in the gospel that Jesus surrounded himself with women, that they were who discovered him after the resurrection and stood with him at the cross, that we were disciples too. And that if we were really listening to the gospels and not, as my dad used to always say, pretending that Jesus was just kidding, that we would have the same kind of profound moral impetus that the church has come around to on issues of race and equality, and that we wouldn't be in fighting for the gospels bumping up sometimes against the church. And that the beautiful example of Mary and sacrifice and humility would be one taught to men too, not just to women, that somehow we're supposed to be happier with our fate because we glory in giving things up, that it be a humility that we're all rooted in, and that we can be a better, more profound community. So I hope, my dream is when the church fully recognizes our humanity, and that it doesn't waste our talent.
Thank you so much. All of this has been pretty inspirational so far. And I know that Dr. Heydt wanted to say just a few words before we close up. And so I will spotlight you. You are on mute though, if you haven't come off.
This has just been wonderful. Thank you again for inviting me to this and to listen to all of you. I am reminded, even though it's only one line in my PowerPoint, I am so strongly, I seriously mean this, reminded, listening to the three of you, of the three women who wanted to become Jesuits in the 1500s and were turned away. I just kept hearing that the whole time you were talking. And the other comments I have is the whole part about listening, which is the strongest recommendation of Decree 14. And your example of someone asked and we shared is so much more powerful than people really will give it credit. And one of the main authors actually ended up feeling that Decree 14 didn't give any strong direction because listening wasn't enough. And I turned right around to him and said, I'm a social worker. If you do active listening, it is enough. Because that kind of listening will lead to the change that all of you have talked about. So it's very exciting to listen. Thank you.
Thank you, Margo. I'm gonna put us on gallery view so everyone can see everyone just a little bit better as we close up. This was really, I had a tear in my eyes a couple times across the presentations of just these little mini 4-minute thoughts. So I so appreciate it. I appreciate tying to the gospel and our Ignatian roots as we think about women's leadership. Thank you everyone for participating. And after a little break, we will have a live Q&A and we look forward to seeing you there. Thank you so much.